All right, everyone. Welcome to what I'm sure is going to be a great year in AP European history. We are going to get started with Unit 1, which is going to cover the Renaissance and exploration and many topics in between. But before we can go forward into the Renaissance, we have to go back a little bit into the Middle Ages. In the Middle Ages, this is a time period spanning roughly 1,000 years from the 5th to the late 15th century. And this was a truly transformative time period in European history. Following the fall of the Roman Empire, Europe enters an era marked by feudalism, the rise of the Catholic Church, and significant social and political changes. And this period also sees the spread of Christianity, the establishment of numerous kingdoms across Europe, and the gradual development of trade and towns, setting the stage for the later cultural and intellectual revival of the Renaissance. Therefore, it's really important that we understand the Middle Ages and how it's crucial to appreciating the profound changes that are going to occur in the Renaissance, as many of the ideas, institutions, and challenges of the medieval world directly influence the rebirth of art, science, and humanism that characterized the Renaissance. So let's get started diving into the Middle Ages. So let's quickly define it in very concise terms. What is the Middle Ages? Like I just noted, this is a period of time that lasted roughly 1,000 years from the 5th century to the 15th century. It's sometimes also referred to as the Dark Ages or the medieval period. And the primary focus in people's lives during this time period was religion. The church formed the basis of most people's lives. The church within their communities and areas was the center point. Most people were uneducated, could not read and write, so they depended on priests to read the Bible and to tell them what was in the Bible, and kind of depended on them for their day-to-day lives. Now, here is the world that we are looking at in medieval Europe. You can see kind of the kingdoms that have coalesced, most notably the Holy Roman Empire, which is a confederation of roughly 300 German-speaking states. You see the Kingdom of France starting to emerge over here on the left, and what will become Spain later on, as well as the fragmented states that make up the Italian peninsula and the fragmented British Isles, which have not become the United Kingdom as of yet. Now, looking at medieval art, we really have to look at this to really understand the profound changes that we're going to see going forward into the Renaissance, because the art of the Middle Ages is much different than what we're going to encounter next in the Renaissance. You can see the religious focus of people's lives in the art. You can see this image with the Virgin Mary holding baby Jesus, with multiple religious and other figures clustered around, in very flat, very 2D, not much variation in the people. If you see, a lot of the faces look very similar. So this is going to change dramatically in the upcoming centuries. Here's a mosaic of Jesus Christ in Istanbul, Turkey, which at that time was Constantinople, kind of the center of the Byzantine Empire. Again, you can see the focus on Christianity and religion in people's lives at this time. Here's an interesting painting. A lot of medieval art was very intriguing, I guess is the word we'll use. So this is a image of Saint Denis and Saint Pietus from the 13th century in a manuscript. Saint Denis as well as Saint Pius, these were said to have been martyred, both these gentlemen, by having the top of their skulls sliced off and having walked quite a long way to the points of their destination after that, holding these cutoffs in their hands, or so the story goes, which is this illustration is attempting to relay to the reader. Here's a version of the Last Supper, much different than probably the ones most of us envision when we think about artwork of the Last Supper. This will be interesting to think back, so kind of lock this in your mind to think back when we get to Leonardo da Vinci and his depiction of the Last Supper. It's going to be a much, much different rendition of this biblical event. So let's look at the political as well as social characteristics of the Middle Ages. So beginning with political, There was really a lack of strong leaders and centralized government during this time. Yes, you had kings and queens that were nominally the heads of their governments, but they hadn't yet centralized power in themselves. So they weren't kind of these absolute monarchs we think about yet in European history. There was a system of local government based on the control of the land and mutual obligations, which I'll show you a little bit more in depth in the next slide with kind of the political hierarchy of the time and how they were kind of obligated to one another. And this kind of started at the top with kings granting land to nobles in exchange for military support. So the type of government that was most prevalent across Europe during this time period was something known as feudalism. Again, we'll talk more about that here in a second. Now, there was a division of society into rigid class systems. Class was determined by birth, so there was very little social mobility. You were not moving up and down the social ladder. And at the very bottom of this social pyramid, there were the serfs or peasants. These were individuals who were bound to the land and had few rights. So this is essentially a form of slavery during this time period because these serfs were tied to the lands of nobles. Their children were born and tied to the land of the same nobles and so forth and so on for generations. They could not really leave this area that they were born into because they were that strongly connected to these noble people that owned the land that they worked. Now here's kind of a depiction of what we're talking about. So this is kind of feudalism at work. So at the top you have the king, and the king owned all the land in the country and he made laws nominally. And he gave an area of land called a fief to rich lords and nobles. Okay, now these lords and nobles were right directly under the king in this hierarchy. And in return for this land, the nobles would agree to supply the king with soldiers and horses for his army. And the nobles gave some land to professional soldiers, known as knights. Okay, and in return, these knights would then fight for the nobles and kings. And this is how the king would get his army under feudalism. Now, again, at the very bottom, which made up the largest proportion of the population, peasants worked for the land for the nobles and the knights, who in turn offered them protection. So it's like, hey, you work our land, we're going to protect you. All right, so you can kind of see what we're talking about with mutual obligation. Each of these tiers were kind of connected and relied on the ones above them. Now, this was really a time of crisis for Europe. This was not an easy time to live. Many individuals living during the Middle Ages lived very hard, short lives. And part of this was because they dealt with so many issues during this 1,000-year time period. So there were 3 years of bad harvests with a number of livestock down. Previous population growth during this time period leads to famine because they're not growing as much. That's going to be able to feed this increasing population, so people starve. Political instability leads to wars among kingdoms and other city-states. And it also leads to peasant uprising. So peasants get tired of their lot in life in some places and try to rise up against these people who are leading them. Okay, and people lived in unsanitary living conditions. Again, people lived in horrible conditions, which generally led to people living shorter lives because they were, getting diseases and germs spreading easier. Things that, again, made their lives very hard and very short. Now, this era would end with the biggest crisis of all, something known as the bubonic plague or the Black Death. Now, here you can see the Black Death and a lot of the other crises being depicted in this painting known as the Triumph of Death. This is an oil panel painting by Peter Bruegel the Elder, who painted this in 1562, kind of depicting the crises of the Middle Ages. And if we look really closely at this, you can see that in the image. So like if you look in the background here, obviously you've got, soldiers, like these skeletons kind of fighting and killing people, representing kind of war. You see, these wagon full of what looks like skulls, which, depict kind of the bubonic plague and the massive deaths that occurred. You can see the barren fields here kind of representing those famines and all those issues people dealt with. So, there's a lot going on here. You could have a whole art history class just kind of decoding, going through this painting. But it's a good illustration of the hardships that people faced during the Middle Ages. Now, looking specifically at the bubonic plague, this was a highly contagious disease that spread across Europe through port cities from 1347 to 1351. Now, that doesn't mean it went away after 1351. It just became less of a threat in these areas that had already seen mass casualties due to this highly contagious disease. In fact, the bubonic plague still exists today, although it's much more treatable with modern medicines. Now, the disease was almost always fatal at this time. And the symptoms included things like swollen lymph nodes, either under your chin or in your armpits and other areas of your body. Large dark splotches on the skin, one reason why it was referred to as the Black Death. High fever, vomiting, painful headaches, all these things tended to precede people dying from this disease. And this is a plague doctor. And some people kind of wonder why they're wearing these kind of beak-shaped masks. And the truth behind that is that these doctors, think of these like medical masks today, they would actually shove herbs and things like that they felt would protect them from breathing in certain germs and put that over their face, although it was questionable how well that actually worked. Now here you can see kind of how that spread. It starts here in the Far East in what's then the Ottoman Empire, and it travels by ship, port by port. And most historians believe and agree that this disease was carried on rats. The fleas on the rats tended to carry the bubonic plague, and then people with their poor hygiene tended to get fleas on them, which would bite them, give them the disease, and then through contact with each other, these people would spread. So Middle Ages to the Renaissance. So the Black Death, this is considered one of the most fatal pandemics in human history. As many as 50 million people perished from the Black Death, perhaps 50% of Europe's 14th century population. Obviously, there aren't, hard records that can verify this, but it spread rapidly and it killed a lot of people. We know that. And sometimes people made it even worse on themselves. If you look at this image, this depiction here, these are people known as flagellants. So these are individuals who would march through towns basically whipping themselves because they believed they had to atone for whatever sins they had caused to make God punish them. And they would march through towns and cities publicly whipping themselves to rid society of its sins. But what they ended up doing was just simply spreading this disease even further, because these whipping of your back would lead to open wounds and the spreading of this disease further. So the disruption of life, though, that the bubonic plague caused created new opportunities in the form of improved agriculture, diversified economies, and greater prosperity. Greater prosperity occurred largely because now the population pressure that they were feeling from centuries of growth had been kind of taken away due to these large, massive casualties of the Black Death. And greater prosperity ended up leading to the revival of classical culture that brought new forms of art, namely the Renaissance. Now I'll end with kind of showing you what historians largely believe this little flea here did, carrying the disease. Now you can see the population trajectory of Europe starting here in about 1100, going from about 1.75 million people in Europe all the way up to nearly 5 million 250 years later. Then you see the Black Death hit and see how much that drops. It drops from almost 5 million to just over 2.5 million. And it continues to drop for about the next 100 years until 1450. And then we finally start to see it climb. And this point right here is where we're going to be going next, because 1450 is around about what we consider the starting point of the Renaissance, and kind of this shift from the Middle Ages to this new kind of modern age and reemergence of these classical texts and new forms of art coming into being. But that is for next time. So if you have any questions, shoot me an email or drop me a message in the comments and I'll get back to you. Have a good one, guys.